And to be doing the right thing, or to follow the right guidelines, here's what you should do. All employee records should be secure at all times, no matter what type of record it is. If it's an employee record or could be defined as such, make sure that it's secured at all times. This means that files should be under lock and key at all times, and if stored electronically on a computer or an external hard drive or on a thumb drive, you want to make sure that appropriate data security measures are implemented in that situation. Now, also, supervisors can have access to personnel files, but should be restricted to access medical information and other non-employment related data, such as one's date of birth, religion, national origin, etc. Even though the supervisors have access to their employees' personnel files, a member of the human resources team should be present while the supervisor is reviewing such records, just to make sure that they are not using that information or that the file does not contain any information that the supervisor can use improperly or in a discriminatory way. And pitfall number 4 is not keeping records long enough. Most personnel records must be maintained anywhere from 1 to 30 years. Whether you keep them on site or archived, you have to make sure that you store them as long as possible. And there are legal requirements, and we will be discussing what those are. And also, employment laws will dictate how long you must keep certain employee records. Going back to our example company, ABC Professional Group, an audit of their files revealed that they weren't keeping their payroll records as long as they should be. According to the Fair Labor Standards Act, employee payroll records must be maintained for at least 3 years. I believe that they were destroying the records only after 2 years. So you want to make sure that you store it long enough and that you follow those guidelines. And the different laws require employers retain certain records for a specified period. The chart on the next slide, which we will show you briefly here, will cover some major employment laws that impact employer record-keeping requirements as well as how long files are to be retained. And here we see the laws. All the way on the left-hand column, we have the laws that apply, and we have the records that those laws address, and the retention period all the way on the right-hand column. So we see for the American and Disabilities Act, you must have records such as accommodation requests, separate files for medical information as well, and any records related to ADA, so the American with Disabilities Act, must be retained for at least 1 year. That 1 year also applies to equal employment opportunity reports and action plans as well. For ERISA, summary plan descriptions, notice of plan changes, and annual reports must be maintained for a minimum of 6 years. For the Fair Labor Standards Act, name, address, date of birth, if under 19, hours worked, the rate of pay, additions and deductions to wages must be stored for a minimum of 3 years. And FMLA records for the Family Medical Leave Act, such as leave requests, disputes, dates of leave, medical certifications, those also, the 3-year retainment period or retention period also applies to those documents. An I-9 form, the later of 3 years or 1 year following termination. So if an employee is on board for 3 years or after they are terminated after 1 year, you can go ahead and dispose of those records. And for OSHA, you want to make sure that the logs of work-related injuries and illnesses are stored for at least 5 years. OSHA inspections, violations, and complaints against your organization are stored for 30 years or more. And any records of exposure to hazardous or toxic agents must also be stored for at least 30 years. Okay, here we have pitfall number 5, failing to report new hires. The wrong approach is to fail to report new hires to the state's new hire reporting agency. Each state requires that employers report new hires, whether through an online new hire reporting system or via the completion of the employee's tax form. 3 new unreported employees in 6 months is definitely asking for trouble. And the ABC group, that's what they did. They actually hired 3 individual employees and didn't report any of them. Employers have 20 days from the date of hire to report the new hire to their state's new hire reporting agency. You should know your state requirements, and whenever you have a new hire, to be sure to report it to the appropriate government agency. And hyperlinks to your state's new hire reporting agency can be found on the hr411.com website, as well as a listing of all the different resources that are available at the state and federal level, so that way you know who to contact. And when you have a certain issue, for example, let's say a new hire reporting, you can log into our website, get the web address or URL, and also the telephone numbers to contact the correct agencies. Okay, and the next pitfall that we have here is restricting employee access. The wrong approach is to forbid employees from accessing their own personnel files. Many states have laws that permit employees access to their personnel files if they request it. Most require that employers grant employees access to their personnel file within a reasonable period of time, following a written request by the employee. Best practice dictates that a reasonable period of time to be between 1 and 2 business days. You should also remember that the content of one's file should never be a surprise. Employees should always receive copies of disciplinary notices and other records that are maintained on them at the time that they are issued. So if you take disciplinary action against an employee, whether it's verbal or written, make sure that you summarize the discussion that you had with the employee, and that you also have them sign the documentation so that they acknowledge that the meeting took place or that the disciplinary action took place. So that way, let's say if you have to terminate them because they don't improve, they can't say that they were wrongfully terminated because you have documentation to support that. It's extremely important that you do so. And now if we take a look at the pitfall number 7, is discarding terminated employee files. The wrong approach. Once an employee leaves the company, you're done with them, right? Absolutely wrong. And following the audit of ABC Professional Group, another common record-keeping pitfall was revealed. Common practice at this company was to immediately discard employee files once employees are no longer employed with them. This is never a good idea. Just because an individual is no longer employed by your company, that doesn't mean that you don't need to keep pertinent information related to their employment with you, especially the reason for termination, as well as the exit interview survey that you conducted with the employee. If ever faced with a lawsuit, you can refer to the employee's file for evidence in support of your decision to terminate the individual. And if the employee resigned, keeping their resignation letter is crucial in providing the employee left on their own terms and they were not terminated. Plus, there are a variety of record retention laws that require files to be kept for a period of time that may be longer than their employment with you. An example of that is, if you had an employee that was employed by you for a year and a half, discarding their file upon termination would be in violation of the IRCA, which requires you to maintain their I-9 form for at least 3 years.